Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Flora Sampson still wasn't sure what she was doing here. Come to that, she wasn't sure if she'd lost her mind. Most people she'd spoken to certainly thought she had. Though, to be fair, that was nothing new. The idea of a lady writer, let alone a reporter, was something people still couldn't quite seem to get their heads around. Her poor dear mother certainly couldn't. A reporter indeed, the old battle axe had said more times than she could count. Really, Flora? What man of quality is going to want to marry a woman who tramps around in dark corners getting soot on her petticoats? Absurd. Absurd, Flora thought, as she stretched her legs in the handsome captain's chair, emblazoned with the Eton College crest. Yes, Mother, absurd is right. If you only knew how much, you might die of shame. But Flora did know. It was only the fact that she would die of curiosity before she died of shame that had brought her here. Because when you got right down to it, the reason for her visit to Eton College now, in the spring of 1930, was truly absurd. It was only her inveterate capacity to follow a hunch which told her it might be true, and that might just be madness superseding whatever genius she possessed as an investigator. To even voice the hypothesis which had brought her to the door of Master James Hawkins, Eton's new teacher of religion, would be enough to make anyone else break out in peals of derisive laughter. To most people, that'd be the end of it. But to Florida, that just made it more fun. Though, of course, she wasn't stupid. She knew that if what she suspected were even conceivable, she'd need evidence that would break through not just the disbelief of her colleagues, but the shell of an identity Hawkins himself had constructed. And so, she had dug and dug before the meeting, trying desperately to validate any piece the teacher's scrupulously vague background she could snatch. And it was only when she discovered that most of it either couldn't be proven or flatly contradicted public record that she began to think she had her man, which had brought her inexorably here to a meeting with Hawkins himself and the exposure of what might be the greatest historical cover-up, as well as the most cast-iron proof of supernatural elements beyond man's comprehension, ever conceived, if she could only get him to admit it. Miss Sampson, the secretary's polite, crisp voice jarred Flora out of her thoughts. She looked up. Yes? Master Hawkins will see you now. Anxiety pooled in Flora's stomach, but she only nodded crisply. Well, thank you. She stood up and, as the secretary pulled the door wide, walked into the lion's den itself. A first look around the room made excitement blossom in her chest, because if any teacher's apartments could have confirmed her suspicions, it was this one. It was nothing like the staid quarters kept by other Eton masters. Maps littered the walls, a perfectly constructed ship in a bottle reclined across the desk. Endless yellowing copies of the Eton Chronicle sprawled on the floor, and to crown all, over the mantelpiece, there hung a rusty, visibly dulled cutlass. However, there was no sign of the master himself. No sign at all. Miss Sampson? Flora jumped at the smooth, aristocratic purr behind her and turned to find Hawkins himself standing behind the open door, which he slid closed with a casual smirk. The sight of him made butterflies rise in her stomach, and not entirely from nerves. He was a true specimen of a man, with long, dark, untamed hair, a wiry, muscled body, which seemed to cling to the inside of his staid master's dress, and a face that might as well have been chiseled from marble, so distinct and graceful were the line of his cheekbones and the cleft of his chin. pair of glittering, forget-me-not blue eyes regarded her with supercilious pleasure. Only two imperfections marred his stunning good looks. His skin, which carried the distinct yellow of fading parchment, giving him the appearance of a man who'd not been so much well-preserved as mummified, and the obviously false wooden hand which sat at his side. Yet, striking though he was physically, what was far more exciting to Flora was not one detail of his appearance argued in any way against what she suspected. She held out her hand. "Master Hawkins, a pleasure to meet you." Instead of simply taking her hand, Hawkins bent at the waist and kissed it with roguish savoir-faire. "Likewise, I'm sure." He straightened, slouched around his desk, and sat down. "Now, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" Flora swallowed and sat down opposite him. "Master Hawkins, I'm afraid you'll think me quite mad." Hawkins' eyes glittered. "Mad? Oh, Miss Sampson, I doubt that. You're far too young. Madness is, after all, what did Shakespeare say? Ah, yes, second childlessness and mere oblivion, the prelude to death. And you, Miss Sampson, look very much alive." He winked, and Flora felt color rise in her cheeks. "In that case, Master Hawkins, perhaps you'll entertain a few questions." "Naturally. Anything for an intrepid member of the press, particularly one so," his eyes flicked to her dress for a second, "unconventional, though I fail to see why you should be interested in me." "Well, you've cut quite a figure since arriving at Eton." "Well, I suppose. There's quite a lot of local gossip about you." A glittering smile. "Nothing good, I hope." "I think we both know the answer to that." Hawkins leaned back and sighed. "I know what people say, particularly my colleagues. Rather boggles their mind that someone like me, someone without what they think as good form, would be teaching at a place like this. I suppose it was inevitable that someone like you would come knocking eventually. Master Hawkins, with respect, it's not simply complaints about form that have me here. If I investigated every teacher with new ideas, I'd never get anything done. Then why me?" Flora drew a sharp breath. "Well, your background, for one. Or should I say, your lack of a background." "My background? Heavens, Miss Sampson, you could have asked anyone about that. I'm not so different from any other teacher here, really. Just an old alum trying to give back to the institution which gave him the best years of his life." "Well, yes, about that." Flora pulled out her notes. "I've been through every edition of the Eton Chronicle and class notes for the past 30 years. There's no James Hawkins mentioned anywhere." Hawkins raised a hand to his breast in mock shock. "Are you accusing me of lying about my attendance, Miss Sampson?" "No, I've spoken to the other teachers. They say you know things no one but an old Etonian would know. And not just an old Etonian either. A pop. It's obvious you went here. Then what are you suggesting? That I've taken this post under a pseudonym?" "Well, yes, exactly. And forgive me, Miss Sampson, but why should I do that?" This was it. The moment when she had to either abandon her entire theory or risk seeming insane, and she knew what she had to do. She smirked back at him knowingly. "You tell me, Captain." Thank God she hadn't blinked when she said, because in only one tiny infinitesimal fraction of a second, something like dread flashed in Hawkins' eyes. Then, like nothing, it was gone. He laughed. "Captain, I have no idea what you mean, Miss Hawkins. I come from thoroughly landlocked stock, I assure you." "I didn't say you were a naval captain." Flora's smirk deepened. "You got there on your own." "Well, it's a natural assumption. I suppose you must have seen all my decorations and assumed I had some unspoken maritime past. I think you do. For God's sakes, doing what? Piracy. Piracy? Yes, piracy. Flora reached into her handbag and extracted something. A visibly aged copy of the Eton Chronicle. You see, Master Hawkins, I didn't just go back through 30 years of records here. I actually went back almost 100. And do you know what I found? Do keep me in suspense, I beg you. That beginning in 1853, this school has no record of its pupils. None at all. Pages listing them have all been ripped out. Why do you suppose that is? Well, I'm sure I don't know. Yes, you do. Because you removed them. Me? Yes, you. And also, I even had a telephone call with the headmaster some weeks ago. He would only say you came highly recommended. I don't see what crime that is. Highly recommended. By a Mr. J.M. Barry. Hawkins stared at her. Miss Sampson, I'm afraid I am really confused. Are you suggesting that a man of my youth and vigor is actually nearly a century old, not to mention none other than the real living embodiment of some story by the estimable Mr. Barry? Flora smiled. Yes, Jas, Hook, Captain, that is precisely what I'm suggesting. You can call me mad if you like, everyone else has. But I think we both know I'm right. But don't worry, I'm not here to expose you. Oh, well, that's a relief, Hawkins said with a roll of his eyes, though Flora could tell there was something slightly intrigued in his face. Slowly he regarded her, his eyes narrowing in scrutiny before speaking. Well, all right, I'll play along. Supposing I was who you say I am, Miss Sampson, despite the fact that even in Mr. Barry's play, Captain Hook is dead, supposing I was him. Tell me this. Why should an infamous blackguard of the Spanish Main, the captain of the Jolly Roger, a fiend so infamous that to even speak his real name would be to set the country ablaze, why should he be willing to trust you? Because I don't believe Mr. Barry. No, there are two sides to every story, Captain. And frankly, if your cover story has holes in it, then Mr. Barry's play is practically littered with them. Well, for instance, Neverland is supposed to be a place without grown-ups, for one. So how did a crew of grown pirates get there? How did a tribe of Indians get there? And why, when there are untold treasures, should they, let alone their desperate and dangerous captain, all fixate on one small boy? Has it occurred to you that it's only a story for children? Hawkins asked. That you might simply be driving yourself mad looking for logic in fairy tales? Flora chuckled. Captain, I don't believe in fairies. The effect this simple sentence wrought on James Hawkins was incredible. As soon as she said it, a smile of utter, savage relief floated across his face, and he leaned in across the desk. Ah, and now you have my attention, Miss Sampson. Cold triumph flashed in his eyes. Good. Go on not believing in fairies. If you can, make sure no one does. Because every time a child says, I don't believe in fairies, the triumph gave way to dark rumination. One of those things falls down dead. And Flora felt her breath catch as the mask of James Hawkins melted away, and Captain Jas, Hook of the Jolly Roger, cadaverous, black-avised, and yet beautiful, met her eyes. What happened to you, Captain? She asked. What really happened to you? Hook only smiled and stared down at his wooden hand. Let me tell you something first, Miss Sampson, just for my curiosity. Yes? His eyes lit with flickering, half-forgotten fire like the spark in a long disused kerosene lamp. What gave me away? Flora grinned. Mr. Barry's speech about you a few years ago. Hook at Eton. It sounded detailed enough that he got it straight from the source. After that, finding the years with the records ripped out confirmed it. Not to mention the name. Jim Hawkins. From Treasure Island? Hook chuckled. Another work on which I'm happy to have been a source. Knew Barbecue and Flint personally, you know. Not sure they ever feared me, whatever Mr. Barry says, but I did know them before the other things happened. And what other things are those? Slowly, Captain James Hook sighed and began to finally tell his true, incredible story. Let us be clear about something before I proceed. Mr. Barry is not wholly to blame for his rendering of my story. A playwright's not a journalist, and though he has taken liberties which excise the story's true moral, nonetheless, he has been kind to me. A share of the proceeds from his version have been mine since it first premiered on the London stage. Not to mention he helped me win for the modest scholar's life which I now possess. A man who knows what it is to be deprived of the milk of human kindness as painfully as I do cannot be too choosy about such mercies when he finds them. Whatever his failures as an artist, Jim Barry gave me a life worth living, and that's an end to it. He sighed, and in that instant, it seemed that every instant of the century he had lived appeared on his face. However, while I cannot reprove him personally, neither can I approve of his play or his novel. Both are dangerous, more dangerous than they should be, and all because of that infernal section when his fairy dies. I begged and pleaded with Jim to take it out, but the man has a bit of a pirate in him, and like all playwrights, he simply cannot bear to grudge his audience an opportunity for applause. Were the play only viewed by adults, this would do no harm, but its popularity among children is a great concern to me, because I know all too well what children clapping for such creatures can produce. But that's a matter for later. You're here for me, after all, not my complaints, and I'll grant you I'm an interesting subject, a man whose true identity would set the country ablaze, Jim calls me, and perhaps he's right. Unfortunately, even I have only the vaguest clues. More than a few have remarked, for example, upon my resemblance to the late Queen Victoria, or to the manner in which my curiously yellow blood was also noted as a feature of a certain lord who fell out of favor with Her Majesty shortly after my birth. Even my true surname, Gordon, holds no answers, for the last man who held it died long before my birth. All I know is that whoever I am, I must be somebody, because only somebody would be raised, as I was, in a secluded manor house with a rotating army of nannies, masters, and servants to look after my every need. Well, perhaps not my every need. They did leave out one, the need to be loved. And perhaps that was the beginning of all my woes. From there followed my time at Eton, the happiest days of my life, as you already know from Mr. Barry's account, and thereafter my premature departure from Balliol College. About that too. There's not much to say, save that I soon determined upon my arrival that the academic life held no true interest for me. The irony of my current post is not lost on me, I assure you. But no. What curiosity I had was reserved for things which could not be learned in books. Not to mention, I knew that, given the unanswerable issue of my birth, my career in respectable society would always be one which took place, as it were, in a terrarium, for there was an invisible and yet immovable ceiling on what I could accomplish. Whereas life outside polite society, in the bellum omnium contra omnes, with its ruthless hierarchy of strength, Oh, there I might find my place without impediment. Which is why, as soon as I caught wind that a naval ship bound for the Spanish Main was docked in a nearby harbor, I immediately volunteered my services. I did not stay on that ship long, though, only long enough to learn the most basic aspects of sea life, and to gain for myself such calluses and bruises as would compensate for my irretrievably Etonian accent. I'm afraid that my seamates also thought me quite useless at first, and made no secret of their opinion. Indeed, they often expressed it in the cruelest of ways, which is why, by the time our ship was eventually attacked by pirates, I had no scruples left for their lives. My training under Eaton's fencing master made quick work of my former tormentors, and indeed, even some of the officers were no match for me. Only their captain, himself an old Estonian, proved to be too skilled, yet by the time he disarmed me, it was too late. The pirates had taken most of the ship. He went down fighting, but he went down all the same. Which was, of course, right when the pirates themselves noticed that I wasn't one of theirs, that, in fact, I wore the uniform of the enemy. One of the stupider ones tried to kill me, thinking I'd only turned on my comrades because I was crazed, but I dispatched them with barely a thought. Which is when their captain finally took notice and called for them to leave off. He approached me and called for parley. I agreed. Then he asked what I wanted, so I told him. I wanted to join him. The man laughed at that. You, he asked, some toff's bastard that's barely more than a lubber? Aye, I said. Thou'rt a fool. A fool who cut down your men. I raised my saber. But very well, try me yourself if you wish. If you kill me, you're short an enemy. If you don't, you'll take me with you. The grizzled old scoundrel looked very surprised at that, yet, for all that, he drew his cutlass and did as I suggested. His first few strikes were easy to avoid, barely more than idle pokes. Yet after some minutes, when he saw I was no green swordsman, he did eventually put up a fight. And what he lacked in technique, let me tell you, he more than made up in ferocity and long practice. I only barely managed to slice his arm before he disarmed me. But I was not done. As he tried to close with me, my boxer's instincts took over, and I threw a fierce left hook, knocking him backwards. A frightful look came into his eyes at that, and he strode toward me, saber held high, as if he meant to kill me, before dropping the sword and embracing me like a brother. By thunder, green as thou lookest, thou'rt a demon, he laughed. What be thy name, me hearty? James Gordon. James Gordon? Ha! He spat. A pox on that. Thou'st knocked one of my teeth loose, lad. You see that? He raised his mouth, lip to expose the spot where one of his blackened teeth had fallen out from my blow. I could only grin. Your bloody fault for getting on the wrong end of my left hook. The captain began to laugh and seized my left hand, clasping it in his own. Aye, and that shall be thy name from hence, he shouted. James Hook, our new shipmate aboard the Jolly Roger. A roar went up from the men, and from then on, I was indeed one of them. I sailed with them for decades after that and served many duties, though my first and most important was training the men to fight as I did. And that dear old captain, Red Hand, as I learned he was called, treated me less like a shipmate and more like a son. He would train me to fight with a pirate's cruelty every night when he got the chance, and by the time he died of a pox, caught off some whore in Tortuga, the men chose me unanimously to succeed him, which is how the reign of Captain Hook truly began. Hawkins paused and looked up at Flora with a sad expression. Now, I don't suppose you can understand this, Miss Sampson, never having been a pirate yourself, but the bond between shipmates engaged in that peculiar enterprise is not one of friendship. It transcends that. It's more like a brotherhood, in the truest sense of the word. You may not like your shipmates all the time, you may not even trust them, but you love them, and even more so as a captain. There wasn't a man on the Jolly Roger I'd not have died for and considered it fair wages. It is essential that you understand this, if the rest of my story is to make any sense at all. Flora nodded. I understand. Very well. Then to the point. As you already know, the name of Captain Hook spread far and wide. There are many in Her Majesty's Navy, or among the Spanish, or even among those who wanted the gold from one of those two countries, who would have happily seen me hanged, and if not hanged, then at least dead. I was more than infamous, Miss Sampson. I was wanted, dead or alive, and by extension, so were my crew, which is how the whole episode began. The Spanish captured one of my men. They obtained, by torture, the knowledge of my movements and sent their fleet to sink me. To be honest, I wish they'd managed it. It would have made everything to come so much simpler. But alas, they did not have the mercy for that. No. Instead, once they had boarded and slaughtered their way through most of my crew, they made me watch as they butchered the rest before breaking my ship's wheel and leaving me drifting into open water. They laughed as they tied me to the mast. El Capitan se hunde con el barco, they taunted. And even not speaking much of their tongue, I knew what it meant. The captain goes down with the ship. For days and nights after that, I floated in agony, helplessly praying for the sun or my own starvation, or even for the waves to kill me just so it could all end. You cannot imagine it. In the words of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. You do know your Coleridge, don't you, Miss Sampson? Flora nodded, and Hawkins' already bitter expression grew haunted. Good. Because once you've finished with me, that might be another little errand for your peculiar brand of investigative genius. Knowing what I now know, I cannot help thinking that Coleridge's Ancient Mariner must have also been a real person. An unlikely muse for Coleridge, just as I've been for Mr. Barry. And oh, what I would have given to meet him, to talk to him, to tell him he's not alone in holding those dreadful memories, nor in being cursed to hold them for an unbounded eternity. I think he and I alone, among the human race, can know what truly lurks on the dreadful frontier of open water. It was on my third day of restless tossing that it appeared. That dreadful sail, that monstrous ship. And oh, horror, the two passengers who crewed it, playing dice for my soul. Death and, oh God. For this reason alone, I know Coleridge knew whereof he spoke. What is it he says? Her lips were red, her looks were free, her locks were yellow as gold, her skin was white as leprosy. The nightmare, life and death, was she, who thicks man's blood with cold. Yes. Death's companion certainly answered to that description. Yet unlike the Ancient Mariner, who became her prey solely thanks to her skill at the dice, Miss Sampson, I was infinitely more foolish. For you see, she lost the game for my soul. I would have died had not I, in my foolish terror of death and recognition of his fearful companion, cried out to her. Wait, I rasped, through parched lips and a ruined throat. Parley? The ship stopped, and life and death turned her eyes upon me, curious. I pressed my advantage. Take me, I cried. If you will only give me back my crew and my ship, then I will endure life and death willingly. Please, restore what I have lost and I am yours. There was a moment's pause, as if all existence had held its breath, and then, oh God, the fiend, the monstrous life and death herself, began to cackle and caper before me. The game is done, she cried, in a voice that was that much more monstrous because its unearthly echo was tinged with a girlish glee. I've won! I've won! And this, Miss Sampson, is when the nightmare which Mr. Barry renders as a children's story truly begins. For that very moment, she reached up to her hair and shook it. Only it was not hair. No, those golden locks were mere illusions which the human mind concocts in order to hide what it dare not face. For every strand of that shimmering golden sunbeam hair was not but endless atoms of light falling down her shoulders like endless pouring grains of sand. No, not sand. Dust. For you see, it was not the head of life and death that those rays of light cascaded from, but rather what nested atop her head. And what was that? Nothing but thousands of small scarab-like forms with golden wings. And it was these which, in shaking her head, she dislodged, revealing the gnarled, mangled miniature parodies on a human form beneath their wings. They swarmed the ship. They swarmed me, as millions of radiant dust motes fell from their shapes. And I, still tied to the mast, was obliged to spend hours that felt like years, screaming as they ate their way through the flesh of my now forever undying and cursedly immortal body. I was not even allowed to pass out, but only scream in endless, peeling, parched accents as my mortal flesh and organs were slowly, viciously gnawed away. But they made one mistake, Miss Sampson, one great and generous mistake. They left my eyes and ears for last. And so, the last thing I remember seeing before things went for my eyes was Death himself begin to turn the ship beside us to sail away, and from the bottom of his cloak I saw something poking out, something black and scaled like a great lizard. And even as my sight went and my own screams echoed, I fancied I could hear something ringing in my ears from the boat beside me. Something soft and tremulous, but unmistakable in its regularity, the tick, tick, tick of Death's great clock, of time itself, winding out. For I realized now, Death had won the game for my soul before my foolish entreaties, and meant to give me the small mercy of being able to recognize him, should I ever wish to face what my unmanly cowardice had postponed forever. How long I floated in black, soundless agony after that, I cannot tell. Nor can I begin to describe the sensation of feeling new muscles restring themselves across my bones, of new flesh creeping with fiendish itching slowness up those muscles, and of new organs sprouting, agonized, inside it. I only now know that when, at last, my new eyes squeezed themselves into my aching sockets, the sight which met my eyes was so sweet, it almost made the hellish ordeal worth it. My crew. My crew was alive again. My ship was at full sail, the skull and crossbones flying triumphantly atop the mast. I was no longer tied to the mast, but, I now realized, had fallen to my knees before it but was free again. And I was cold, for I soon realized that my tormentors had allowed my body to grow new flesh. It had not been able to grow new clothes, which meant that I was entirely naked. Can you imagine, Miss Sampson? I, a captain, naked before my crew. Now that he mentioned it, Flora could imagine it, which was precisely the problem. Despite the soul-searing terror of the narrative up to this point, she could feel a faint scarlet blush stealing up her neck at this last detail. She coughed. It sounds dreadfully embarrassing. Hawkins laughed. Embarrassing? Yes, I suppose it might have been. For another man, at another time. But I was so grateful to be free of pain, and to see my crew alive, that it only made me laugh. I sprang to my feet and tried to embrace the first man I saw, but he quite reasonably jumped back, shocked that his captain should try to embrace him, let alone in his natural state. It was then that I began to wonder if they'd been aware of my presence at all before then, or if life and death had simply veiled my agonized form from them until its awful metamorphosis into undeath was complete. But either way, all was soon set right. My bosun took me in hand and guided me to my cabin, where he helped me to dress, albeit in a set of clothes so ornamental that, even at my height of infamy, I would have considered them excessive. I would not remark upon it, except that it was in noticing that inconsistency that I began to notice all the others. For one thing, my cabin was piled high with old issues of the Eton Chronicle, as if the dear old masters had somehow managed to find a carrier willing to take it to the Spanish Main, let alone onto a ship owned by an infamous privateer. But more than that, when I actually tried speaking to the bosun Smee, who I remembered as a cussed old salt known for his faculty with the cat, I found that his personality had somehow become not merely gentle, but actually childlike. I had much the same experience when I left the cabin and called the ship to assembly, or rather tried to call it, only to discover that discipline on the ship was non-existent because the crew, while they looked like my crew and sounded like my crew, had also regressed into seeming childishness. In fact, when I spoke sharply to one or two of them and told them to look sharp, tears came to their eyes, and one fellow even began to suck his thumb. I might have laughed, only when I saw it I began to fear that a terrible trick had been played upon me due to a careless omission on my part. That is to say, I had asked life and death to return my ship and my crew, but I had not asked for my crew to become back sane. Which is why, instead of my old crew of hardened pirates, I now found myself saddled with a ship full of childlike half-wits in their guise. A part of me was tempted to despair right then, but my manful spirit overcame the urge, so I had what was, effectively, a crew of boys. So what? Boys might learn as well as anyone, might mature as well as anyone, even if I'd have to be gentler with them, and anyway, what did it matter? We'd all been granted life in death, after all, hadn't we? We could not die, could not be killed. I had forever to teach them to return to their old ways if I wanted it, and none could take it from me. And so, I resolved to be patient and gentle until such time as they could recover their old natures. Oh, a lesser captain might have forced them all off the plank, Miss Sampson, to be sure, but not me. Not Jazz Hook of the Jolly Roger. I loved my men. For them, I had endured hell twice. To reawaken their old souls after that was nothing. And I will say this, for all their lack of maritime discipline, their old instincts for how to sail a ship did at least seem to be intact. What's more, discipline turned out to be unnecessary because none of them seemed to have any desire to slack at his duties. Rather, they treated the sailing of the ship as one great delightful game and played their parts without complaint as we drifted pleasantly for almost an hour when a cry went up from the crow's nest. "Land!" the voice shouted above. "Land to starboard!" Now, you must understand, while I was relieved by this, what captain does not feel relief at the prospect of restocking his provisions? I was not particularly surprised. We had, after all, been attacked off the coast of Florida. It was not impossible that in the days of agony since then, we drifted toward some island or perhaps toward Florida itself. When I drew my spyglass and looked to starboard, I expected to see one of any number of a dozen familiar ports growing closer. But I didn't. Quite the opposite. The island I beheld then was no island I'd ever seen in my life. In truth, It did not look like any island on any map I'd ever beheld, nor was there any sign of civilization to be seen at a distance. At this, my heart grew apprehensive. How far had we sailed when I writhed in agony, and for how long? I decided I'd have to wait for night and judge by the stars, for it would not do to leave my ship docked at a savage island indefinitely. However, having resolved this, the thrill of discovery took me, and I began to think of the stories told by boys of unknown islands where pirate crews might secret away treasure, or even of Columbus and Pizarro. Might I, James Hook, join such august ranks as a discoverer of new worlds, and after facing down death and his companion? That would be the stuff of legends, Miss Sampson, the stuff of children's stories. Hawkins began to laugh bitterly. And oh, how right I was. How damnable the results. Yes, indeed. I was the first to discover that hellish place, that haven of infantile cruelty, that eternal torture chamber, that Neverland. Had I known what awaited us on that island, I would have seized the wheel and tried to drag the ship off course, or perhaps even to wreck it, rather than go 1 yard closer. But I did not know, and so permitted life and death's true torment to begin. We made landfall within a quarter of an hour, and no sooner did we drop our anchor than the wind which carried us stopped instantly. It did not rise again. No, not once in years, perhaps centuries, did the wind ever rise, which meant that we, poor devils, were left marooned on that island. This might have been an escape under other circumstances, for at least it might have led the poor devils under my command to starve, but not there, for you see, our stores never ran dry. No matter how indulgently we plundered them, the day after they'd always be as full as if we had not touched a crumb or drank a drop. And as I was soon to learn, that was the least, and the least terrible, of what each new day would restore. Naturally, I organized a search party to explore the island, planning to make a map of its dimensions and see if it were truly as deserted as it looked. But here, I don't suppose I can manage to keep you in suspense. You know, of course, that it was not deserted. No, as I was soon to learn, it was very much inhabited, but not by men, by demons, deliberately selected and encouraged by Life and Death herself to plague me. The first of these demons we encountered were the natives, though, quite honestly, I hesitate to call them that. I'm a pirate, Miss Sampson. I have had dealings with native tribes, after all. There was a kinship between people like me and people like them in our desire to plunder the respectable European settler for all he was worth. I even know a few of their tongues, and understand too well the queer species of warlike honor which attends the native's mind. These natives, however, had no honor, warlike or otherwise. Indeed, they were less like a real tribe than like a particularly nasty child's idea of one. Yet for all that, they fought like devils, and had the minds to match, for their ambush caught us completely by surprise, and before we even knew what was happening, 3 of my men lay dead. I desperately tried to mount a counterattack, but my men, being mental children, were so frightened that they broke into a panicked retreat, which became a bloody rout. I was lucky to get back to the ship with a handful of men still alive and to draw up the lifeboats before our attackers could commandeer them. I thought surely this would be enough to keep us safe. After all, surely no man, native or European, could cross deep water without drowning. Which was true. No man could. But that was before I met the boy. Hawkins' hands began to shake, and he stood hastily from his desk. My apologies, Miss Sampson, but if I'm to continue, some liquid courage is in order. He crossed to a large globe in the corner of the room and pulled it upward to reveal several decanters full of unidentifiable spirits with glasses to match. Hawkins uncorked one and poured himself a generous glass before knocking it back in one gulp and pulling a face. Then he held an unspoiled glass out to Flora. "Anything for you, Miss Sampson? Rum? Whiskey?" Flora shook her head, half in answer, half in disbelief, at being offered rum by Captain Hook. No, thank you." Hawkins nodded, already in the act of refilling his glass. "As you wish. Another swallow. Right, to the most important part of the story, I suppose." He reseated himself and sighed. "You know, when Mr. Barry first showed me his play, Miss Sampson, I was furious with him. It felt like a betrayal of everything I had told him about my singular experience. 'How can you make that thing your hero?' I bellowed. 'If I still had my hook, I'd open your throat for it.' And the poor fellow took it quite well, though. 'Now, Jimmy,' that's what he called me, in order to differentiate his name from mine, 'be reasonable. Think what you've told me of your exploits, old boy. I simply can't make people root for an infamous blackguard of the Spanish Main to kill a child.' 'But it wasn't a child,' I shouted back. 'It was a demon, Mr. Barry, a demon. You know that better than anyone.' 'It doesn't matter what I know, Jimmy. What matters is what I can convince people to believe, and you do me a dishonor in saying I made Peter my hero. If you'll turn on to the end, you'll see he ends up a worse scoundrel than you. I'm being practical, Jimmy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to twist your story beyond all recognition. The central theme is that children are cruel. It may take a bit for people to see how much that's true, but it comes in at the end." Hawkins shook his head. "Well, of course, he was telling the truth, and he knew his business better than I, Miss Sampson, for his play has made both of us rich men. And I suppose there are limits to what the stage can show, limits which make my story very difficult to convey in a convincing way. But that does not change the truth. Which brings me back to my first meeting with the boy, with Pan, which, believe me, is the only name I ever called it. Jim Barry invented that Peter part to humanize the beast. But you can't humanize what is not human, and Pan was not human. I knew that the moment I first beheld it, soaring toward us, its childlike body held up by the same ghastly sunbeam dust which fell from the wings of my scarab tormentors as they ate my body. But worse still than that was the thrill of recognition I felt when I saw its face and realized this was no mere child, for in its leering, cruel, juvenile features, I beheld nothing less than a perfect replica of my own features when I was a boy. It landed on the ship and brandished a sword. Well, what could I do? I ordered my men to kill it, whatever it was, and God bless them, they certainly tried. But here, too, fresh horrors were to be found, for when it began to fight, I saw in its effortless, graceful, perfect, good form a perfect image of how I must have fought when I first struck down my comrades on that first naval vessel. It even knew how to box as I did, complete with the mighty left hook I had perfected, and as it cut through my men like butter, I finally understood the full depth of life and death's cruelty. She had returned my crew and my ship to me, but only to deliver us into battle with the embodiment of what had gotten my crew killed and me damned in the first place. My own childish inability to bear authority or to accept limitations of any kind. After all, had I not become a pirate because I wanted to rise higher than I could in polite society? Well, if rising higher than I ought to was what I wanted, then naturally the demon sent to mock me would take the form of a flying boy. Had I not slaughtered men who trusted me and their captain with them out of pique? Why, then the demon would exact the same revenge on me that I was the captain. Of course, I had also refused to accept death, willingly damning not only my soul, my own soul, but the souls of all my crew, in order to avoid that last shred of consequence for my actions. But this, I admit, I did not see how the creature could imitate, at least not yet. All I knew was that I would have to close with it, with this awful mirror of the cruel, callow, thoughtless boy I'd been, and kill it if I could. But I could not. God, not even if I had 100 men could I have done that. The creature was so devilishly quick, so infernally graceful, and so utterly fearless that I could have soon have fought the wind. It disarmed me in seconds, pinned me to the ship's deck with an agonizing sword thrust into my gullet, and then began what I was soon to learn was its favorite grisly game. It pulled my organs out, just as living death fey accomplices had done. It flayed away my skin with a carving knife. It pulled my muscles from my bones and sliced my eyes and tongue and ears away with all the careless, cruel curiosity of a child pulling wings off a butterfly. And then it left me, once more in soundless darkness, to scream and suffer on the deck of my ship. And here, the full extent of the nightmare revealed itself. For, like Prometheus, screaming each day under the ministrations of the hawk, once more my organs regrew, my muscles restrung themselves, and my flesh crept back. And once more, when I opened my eyes to the sound of a child's imitation of a cock-crow, I found myself standing naked among my men, alive again, and childlike as before, with the ship beneath our feet where no sign of blood or pain was to be found. In fact, I soon learned that my men remembered nothing at all of the previous day or of its horrors. In their minds, we had simply docked at Neverland and had been there forever. Ha! Well, even if they didn't remember Miss Sampson, I did. And because I was still a fool with a fighting spirit, I fancied that the prison I found myself in could somehow be outwitted. That if I were clever enough or discovered the right stratagem, I could conquer the entire island, kill its demonic inhabitants, and make it a safe haven for me and my men to spend eternity. Since I soon discovered that the hold was full, which obviated the need to go to ashore, I spent the rest of the day drilling my men in tactics and fighting until well into the night. And when I finally went to sleep in my cabin, I dreamt of vengeance. But when I woke, once more to the sound of that damnable child's crowing, such dreams faded with the rest. For once more my men remembered nothing of the previous day. However, this time, I didn't even have time to try to reteach them, because in mere hours the ship was under attack again, which was when I discovered the first of several things which would ultimately permit my escape. Pam was not alone. Well, really, why should he be? After all, life and death had not only me, but my entire crew to torture, if she liked. It was not so impossible to imagine that she might have created child versions of all of us to aid in the torture. Yet when I beheld the boys who fought at the demon's side as it landed on our ship and began its merciless attack, I knew that this was not the way of things. None of these boys acted in the least bit like any member of my crew. They did not indeed even resemble them. They really seemed to be just normal boys, albeit under the spell of the demon, which, despite the ruthless efficiency of their assault, made my curiosity bloom. If these boys were not creations of life and death, but were rather actual children, then how had they been brought to Neverland, and for what purpose? Of course, this thought did nothing to prevent their cutting their way through my men with ridiculous ease. nor did it prevent the demon from once more humiliating me and stripping away my body with its usual sadistic glee. But even as I howled in agony for yet another awful night, until the thing's crowing roused me again, that thought kept me sane, for in it I saw just a glimmer of hope. After all, if those boys had come from somewhere, then there must be another way in to Neverland. And if there was a way in, then surely there was a way out. It was small hope, but it was hope I needed, as the countless days and countless defeats crashed down upon me despite all my best efforts at preparing my men or securing the ship against attack. I could not understand it at the time, but I do now. Hawkins' eyes burned and he crossed to the globe, filling another glass with rum and knocking it back greedily. Then he turned to Flora, his eyes haunted. You know, I assume, Miss Sampson, that when children play at Peter Pan, he spat the name, the strongest always choose to be Peter. They force the baby to be Hook. His hands clenched. The baby, Miss Sampson. That's where the canker gnaws, and not as Mr. Barry would have it, because it hurts my pride. No, that canker gnaws because only now do I see that in these children games, the fate of my men was constantly decided. The fact that the pirates never win when children play at Neverland, as Mr. Barry calls that circle of hell, was the precise reason why my stratagems availed me nothing, and I was forced to watch my poor crew die, again and again and again and again, sometimes in the most horrible ways, and always to cursedly be reborn in their old childlike state the next day. It was the stuff of the darkest hole in Tartarus, Miss Sampson, my dance with Pan, with him as the boulder and I as Sisyphus, and for long eons of time I truly despaired of ever escaping that hell. However, despite the grotesque tedium and monotony of my existence as a perpetual sufferer of cruelties at the hands of Pan and his native allies, I remained a thinking man, which was what finally permitted me to escape the tedium and monotony, if not the grotesquerie. All right, I said to myself, so I will be forced to suffer most every night until Pan crows, only for the exercise to repeat itself the next day. Let us take that for granted. If that's the case, then there is no reason for me to care for my safety, which will be compromised no matter what. Yet I still have an advantage. Unlike my men, I can remember, I can learn, and therefore I can learn where the walls of this cage lie, and perhaps perceive what holes might be found within them. So, when I next awoke, screaming from my near nightly agonies at Pan's hands, I did not stay on the ship. Instead, I led my men into Neverland again, and this time, because I knew where the natives had laid their traps before, I avoided them. Oh, and it took us no more than 5 minutes to find more traps, to be sure, and to die in yet more horrible ways, but the next day, I avoided those traps as well. I spent years memorizing every single dishonorable trick the island could throw at me to thwart my progress, and then years more learning its geography. And then, only then, after years of endless, frustrating pain, did I begin to strain at the bars of my cage. My first plan was obvious. I would capture one of Pan's boys and torture the location of his leader's hiding place from him. But all attempts at this failed. Even when I could catch one of them, Pan would always arrive too quickly for me to break him. Though I did learn one useful thing from these failures. The boys feared both pain and death. They did not know that they would revive upon the morrow, no matter what happened. Knowing this, I immediately set about capturing a native and seeing if the same was true of them. Yes, it was. Which was the first moment I began to realize that my knowledge of how the prison worked was an advantage. I knew I would suffer, no matter what happened, and be reborn, but my enemies did not, which meant I could threaten them with tortures and deaths that, while impermanent, still had the power to compel truth. Oh, yes, I would never manage to carry them off. Pan would always arrive to prevent that, but my enemies never remembered this, no more than my men did. Unfortunately, however, torturing and killing the natives proved as useless as the boys. They had no knowledge of the subject I was most keen to understand. No, they did not know where Pan's boys came from, no more than I did. No, they did not know how he flew. No, they did not know how to leave Neverland. They had no consciousness that there was anywhere else in the world. The only thing of use I was able to get out of one of them was that their princess might know how to reach Pan's hideout, but even this was cold comfort, for without years more of memorizing the natives' movements, I could not possibly hope to capture the girl in question. Yet, what other choice did I have? If this was my only way to make a fiend vulnerable, then it was what I would have to do. So with a great deal of fatalistic dread, I started once more trying to fight the natives, fruitless as it always seemed. It took years of dying and agony before I could fight them to a standstill. It took a decade more to rout them, and it took yet one more decade to defeat them and keep their princess alive. But she was made of sterner stuff than I expected. Even the few times when I was able to put her to the question, she held up under torture as a queen ought, and never once revealed any knowledge of Pan's whereabouts. However, I do not begrudge the child, or illusion of one, or whatever she was, because in my efforts to question her, I inadvertently learned something far more important. You see, Miss Sampson, Pan did not like how thoroughly I refused to be broken, and nor, I assume, did his mistress. And he particularly did not like that I was able to hurt his fellow tormentors, however briefly, which is what led him finally to slip up in one of our countless duels aboard the ship. For you see, once he beat me, he'd grown bored of pinning me to the deck, at least right away, and had since taken to chopping off my limbs, which of course would always grow back the next day. However, one day, when he managed to sever my left hand, a sensation I was so used to that I managed to choke back my cry of pain, I heard something I did not expect. Something I had almost forgotten could exist. In my countless years of savage combat with Neverland's many cruelties, the sound of a ticking clock coming from beneath the ship, and because I was not yet pinned to the deck, I managed to back away from Pan just enough to sneak a single look over the edge of the ship and behold the great black crocodile beneath, staring up at me with the hollow eyes of death, and the sound of the ticking deep within its gullet, which was when an idea finally struck me. "Oh, mercy, Pan!" I cried, trying as best as I could for the terror of my early days in my fiend's clutches. "Mercy! Do what ye like with me, you heartless boy, only don't throw me hand to that crocodile, I beg ye." And of course, because for all his immortality and strength, Pan was still a spiteful, hateful, cruel child, he laughed. And then, without so much as a second thought, he threw my hand down in the water, where the crocodile snatched it in his jaws and swallowed it whole. And though I screamed and cried and flubbered after that, as I had so many times before under his ministrations, in my heart, Miss Sampson, I had hope for the first time. For when the croc had swallowed and an experiment had begun, and I had only to wait and see if it bore fruit. So you can imagine my utter delight when Pan crowed the next day, and instead of waking to find myself restored completely, oh wonder, my hand still pained me, because it was still missing. My experiment had worked, and thanks be to God, I now knew that there was a way of escape, should I ever be desperate enough to take it, which was that I were to throw myself to that crocodile, to death, as I should have done when he first sailed by. I would finally be free of the horrors of Neverland. Oh, I almost threw myself in the croc's jaws that very second, Miss Sampson. But I was held back, not just by fear, but by remorse. After all, to give myself up to death, while it would free me from the horrors of Neverland, it would leave my poor, childish crew with no hope of escape. No. For all the many lines I'd crossed since arriving in that dreadful place, I still cared for my crew as if they were brothers or even sons, Miss Sampson, and I could not bear to do something so selfish. Not when the only people who had ever loved me in my life would be left to hell. At first I considered making them all walk the plank, only to follow me myself, when the last had been eaten. But the mere thought infuriated me. The poor devils would be terrified. They would not know that their captain did it as a mercy. They would not understand that their captain did it as a mercy. And why should they be forced to endure it? Why, after all the pain that we had been all through, should we have been required to accept such a dreadful end? It would make the whole thing pointless. It would insult all we had already endured. No. Throwing us all into the jaws of death was not the way. It might suffice as a last resort, but not until we'd tried everything to achieve what I now suspected would truly defeat our captors: the death of Pan, and of the fragment of life and death that attended and protected him. Yes. If I could accomplish that even once, even if it didn't take, then the torture chamber would lose its meaning. I would have every entity within Neverland at my mercy, and life and death's cruel game would be defeated on its own terms. She would have no choice but to release us all, simply to avoid my compounding the humiliation. And so, now, finally possessed of a plan, however difficult, I returned to my endless game of attrition with Pan and his mistress. And even though they kept visiting agony upon agony on me now, I began to almost relish the frustration with which they inflicted it. They, after all, had to win this game every time, whereas I only had to win once. Once more, now that I had my way out, I no longer felt like a prisoner to their ministrations, but rather like a willing participant who was simply biding his time until he could turn the tables. Which is why, slowly, day after day, hour by hour, minute by minute, stroke by stroke, and scream by scream, I began to learn how to fight Pan himself, and to begin to penetrate his good form, which had once seemed invincible. And then one day, in a blast of pure luck, the final puzzle piece snapped into place. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The moment when, peering through my spyglass, I caught sight of Pan soaring down to Neverland's surface. But not alone, no. This time, he had a company, a girl and 2 boys. Well, that answered one question. Where did Pan's companions come from? But there was yet another, more tantalizing detail. The fiendish shard of life and death which accompanied him tried to send the girl to her death almost as soon as they got within sight of the island. It was a maddeningly suggestive detail, and it sent my mind whirring such that I barely even noticed my surroundings for hours. But at last, something occurred to me. Something blindingly obvious, and yet only noticeable now that it was no longer true. The fiend only ever took boys. This was the first time it had brought back a girl, a living girl, not an illusion like the natives' princess or the mermaids, and something in that threatened life and death, though for what reason I could not imagine. Mr. Barry, of course, credited the whole thing to romantic jealousy in his play, which he knows is an absurd notion as well as I. Still, if the motive is not real, the actions are, and it was only in spying on the boys with all the tools of stealth and skullduggery I had learned to employ that I began to suspect why. Because, you see, Mr. Barry tells the truth at one point. Pan had brought the girl back to be a mother, and in that little detail I began to spy the truth. For what is a mother, Miss Sampson, but a giver of life? Real life, not the counterfeit mockery of life and death. That child's very presence on an island full of boys was an implicit challenge to the order of the fiend which ruled Neverland. For should she accept a union with any of the boys, life would intrude in full and potentially break the power of life and death forever. But it was only when I woke the next day that I realized what a challenge she truly posed, because for the first time when I checked our stores, I found that they were depleted. I questioned my men and found that they remembered the day that had passed, which is when I knew what my next step must be. I must capture the girl. Oh, not out of some perverse desire, but for a simpler reason. Because Pan would come to save her, and because I had not yet found the means to beat him, he would succeed, which meant he would make the child desire him, and set in motion the means by which life and death's hold on Neverland might be broken forever. Oh, yes, if I could make the whole pantomime convincing enough, then there would be no need to defeat Pan myself. His very urges as a boy, if boy he was, would do the work for me. And so, with planning as careful and as devious as any I had devised when I was still the terror of the Spanish Main, I set about laying my final trap. I kidnapped the girl. I took steps to kill Pan, which I knew would not succeed, but which I knew would make her despair of his survival. I even managed to use the wedge that the girl's presence drove between Pan and his fragment of life and death to make the hideous sprite reveal the location of his hiding place before trapping it in a lamp and tossing it to the bottom of the sea, so that if it were possible to kill Pan, I would accomplish it and free us all no matter what happened. Then I waited. As I predicted, Pan came. He fought me, and while I came as close as I had ever come to defeating him, even at my best, I knew I was still no match for him. But what was more, I knew that my plan could not work if the girl believed he had spared my life. So I lured him to the topmost part of the ship until we were overlooking the ocean, and when he finally showed his frustration and kicked me in the ocean, I could hardly contain my glee. "Bad form, Peter," I shouted as I plummeted toward the open crocodile's jaws, laughing as I thought of how, in finally accepting the embrace of death, had finally sprung a trap which might unravel my great mistake once and for all. I did not even bother to struggle as death caught me in his jaws. He paused and smiled softly, a hint of mourning entering his face. Flora, however, was too fascinated to let the moment pass. She leaned forward in her seat and, without thinking, immediately asked, "And then?" Hawkins looked up at her in mild surprise. "And then?" he repeated, as a hollow look came into his eyes. "Then there was pain, Miss Sampson. Pain beyond all other pain I had yet experienced. Pain that could unman any man, even a terror of the Spanish Main. I felt every bone crack beneath the crocodile's teeth. I felt the acid of its stomach peel away my flesh. Every inch of my physical form was violated, and I was sure that this time I would not wake, for it was Death himself who inflicted the wounds, not his cruel counterpart or one of her minions. But as you can see, I was mistaken, for my soul still belonged to life and death, even if my body no longer was her prey. She had not broken her bargain with me, even if I had fled from it, which is why when I woke next, it was to find myself shivering, naked, and yet alive. But not this time in Neverland. No, this time I recognized the land I was on, dimly, as if from a dream, as the soil of what was once the Spanish Main. Florida, to be exact, though certainly not the Florida I remembered, for, as you so cleverly realized, I'm a stranger in this century. As for how I managed to steal and rob and find my way back to England, well, that tale alone could take hours in its own right. What is important, however, is that I made my way to Eton, where, as you so cleverly noticed, I ripped the records of my attendance out, just as Mr. Barry says. In fact, it was thanks to my return to Eton that Mr. Barry and I first met, for he found me sitting on the college wall, the low one, on which only members of the Pop Society may sit, and there saved me from being accosted by a policeman. It was from there that I told him the story I have just told you, and bless him, though a lesser person would have thought me a madman, Mr. Barry took me in hand and gave me a home and comforts until such time as he could find me a more suitable, more decent engagement. He smiled and sat up in his chair, spreading his hands, which is what brought me, at last, back to dear Eton permanently, where you find me now. They say I teach religion, and I do, though I fear it's rather an overly polite way of describing my true scholarly pursuits, which the other masters frown upon a great deal. You see, Miss Sampson, what I am truly a scholar of is not religion, writ large, but rather a scholar of the geography of hell. He raised one finger and pointed at the maps on the walls, and when Flora looked closer, she saw immediately what he meant. These weren't maps of anywhere on Earth. Rather, they appeared to be hand-drawn maps of various versions of hell, some which even she recognized, Dante and Milton, and others which looked wholly foreign and frightening. A dark smile twisted Hawkins' mouth. I've read every book in every language a man could learn on the subject of hell, Miss Sampson, and for one very simple reason, because I know that my final stratagem failed. Wendy Darling, though that's not the girl's real name, did not conceive a child with Pam. I know because I found her some years ago in a hospital. She was old and gray and her eyes barely worked, but she knew me in an instant, and I had to take great pains to assure her of my kind intentions before she would talk. But eventually talk she did. And because I know what happened after I was eaten, I know that my men are still suffering somewhere in that hellish Netherland, where boys never grow up and pirates always lose their battles and die screaming for their mothers. So I have taken it upon myself to learn all I can of hell, not so I may avoid it, but so that I may know how to enter it again, and in which damnable circle I must look to find the island where the souls of my crew are trapped. What else can I do, Miss Sampson, knowing that is only my folly that put them there? I ask you, what else? Flora waited for him to go on, but when he didn't, she realized the question wasn't rhetorical. But what could she say? She was almost too riveted by the story, and by the haunted dark eyes of James Hawkins, or Gordon, or Hook himself, to speak. She tried to speak, but her mouth felt dry. I don't know, Captain. No? What would you do then, Miss Sampson? Not to save your crew, but to save your family, perhaps your husband. I'm not married. A slight wolfish twinkle entered Hawkins' eyes, then vanished. I beg your pardon. Your mother, then. We all have mothers, after all, except Pan. What would you do to save her from hell? Mom and I don't get on very well, but if she were in hell, Captain, I'd do anything to get her out. Hawkins relaxed, his eyes closing with relief. Thank you, Miss Sampson. He reached into his desk idly, and a moment later she heard a faint metallic click issue from within. "Thank you. You've eased my heart on a very important point." Flora smiled, but unbidden, fear was rising in her at the queer, almost predatory look in James Hawkins' eyes. "I'm glad." She stood. "Well, Captain, this has been most enlightening, but if there's nothing else..." A dagger whizzed by her ear as she turned toward the door, burying itself in the wood. The sight froze her for a second, before her feet worked again and she tensed to run. But the movement came too late. The bite of something curved, metal, and razor-sharp was already at her throat. "You're not going anywhere, Miss Sampson," purred Jazz Hook, captain of the Jolly Roger. "Not now. I'm sorry, but you're simply too valuable." "Captain, what are you doing?" "Exactly what you said a man in my position should do, Miss Sampson. Anything. You see, the one thing I didn't mention about my little journey through the crocodile's gullet is that I didn't make it alone. No, that lamp containing the living shard of life and death got swallowed too. I've kept it, and the fiend within ever since. Until very recently, I had no idea how to use her because I had no idea how one might return to Neverland. But just a few nights ago, I had something of a breakthrough. It was Mr. Barry's play that did it. Fairies, life and death, are bound by belief. Well, the entire world now believes that you can get to Neverland by following the second star to the right, which means I should be able to as well. I've been waiting for an opportunity like this." "An opportunity for what? Captain, I don't..." "Ah, Miss Simpson, don't you remember? The one thing life and death cannot abide in her realm is a woman. A mother, and ideally a mother with child. Oh, I could have snatched any tramp off the street if I wanted, but when you came right into my lap... I'm a pirate, Miss Sampson. I not only take what I want, I take it where I want." "Please," Flora stammered, tears of fear suddenly coming to her eyes. "Please, I..." But her words were cut off as Hook's one good hand came into view above her, and she beheld what was in it. It was just as he'd said, a horrid miniature mockery on the human form, its gangly limbs twisted, its mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth, its skin white as leprosy, and from its wings, golden and scarab-like, a hail of motes of sunlight fell down onto her eyes. "Don't cry, Miss Sampson," breathed Captain James Hook, his voice pregnant with cold mirth. "That's not the way to get to Neverland. You know the way from Mr. Barry's play, don't you, Miss Sampson? And it's not tears, no. You think lovely, wonderful thoughts." The room began to spin, and the last thing Flora saw as her body rose into the air was Hook's terrible, beautiful smile. And up we go.
Chilling tales for dark nights.